Okay, Joe.
You just sink yourself inside.
Huh?
Just sink yourself inside.
I think
You
the
just
fans
face
are
one way
too
to the
noisy.
other.
We can start.
In 2 minutes, we want to plan gesture. Ready to start now. Mr. Young, we wait for my fellow commissioners of the Parliamentary Reform Commission, President of the Senate and former Member of Parliament for Christchurch East, Mr. Reginald Farley, former Attorney General and Member of Parliament for St. Philip South, Mr. Adriel Braffitt, and members of the audience here at Lester Vaughn Secondary School and the online audience, good night. The focus of tonight's discussion will be on the Cabinet of Barbados, the role of ministers and their relationship with Parliament. I am as anxious as you are to hear what our distinguished panelists have to say. But I thought that as the chairman of the Parliamentary Reform Commission and as chair of tonight's proceedings, I would make a few introductory remarks before giving way to the panel. The first point I wish to make is that Barbados did not always have a cabinet. There was a time when the governor presided over a committee known as the Executive Committee, which consisted of members of the House of Assembly chosen from different groups. That committee was the forerunner to what we now know as the Cabinet. In 1946, Barbados experienced its first major constitutional advance since 1881, following which a system of semi-ministerial government known as the Bush Experiment was introduced by the then governor, Sir Grattan Bush. At that time in 1946, the franchise was severely restricted, and the vast majority of Barbadians were excluded from participation in politics. The trade union movement was in its infancy, and the party system was not at all fully developed. The old elite of a proud, white, and powerful white minority dominated the commanding heights of the economy and exercised a disproportionate amount of political influence. But by 1951, the masses were beginning to gain political control following the general elections, which was held on the basis of adult suffrage. Every man and woman over 21 was able to vote. Up until 1946, Barbados was governed by a system described as the old representative system, and the head of affairs was the governor as the Crown's representative, assisted by an executive committee. And this committee was the equivalent of the British Privy Council, which served as a link between the governor and elected representatives. The committee consisted of the governor, the colonial secretary, the attorney general, and any other person or persons appointed by the Secretary of State for the colonies on the governor's advice, provided there were not already members of the Executive Council. In addition, there was one person from the Legislative Council, precursor to the Senate, established in 1964. This committee was partly advisory, and the governor need not act on its advice even if the committee was unanimous. I should add that the House of Assembly members were chosen without any regard for their ideology or party affiliation. Cabinet government as we know it today was established in Barbados in 1958. Thereafter, the general direction and control of government on internal matters was passed to the Premier and his ministers meeting as a cabinet. And importantly, the governor did not attend the cabinet. Up to that point, the governor chaired ministerial meetings. But thereafter, 1958, he did not attend the cabinet. With cabinet government, the chief secretary, the attorney general, then a civil servant, and the financial secretary were removed from the executive committee as of right and attended the cabinet only on request. The premier could request a meeting of the executive to discuss any matter. By 1961, the Democratic Labour Party came to power, and the Attorney General was Hilton A. Vaughn, Minister without portfolio. By 1964, 2 years before independence in 1966, the Attorney General was no longer a civil servant, but a political appointment, and the office of the Solicitor General was retained as a civil service appointment. From 1964 until the present time, the office of the Attorney General has remained a political appointment. And that short introduction to some aspects of tonight's proceedings constitute my opening statement, and I will now ask members of the panel to get ready to address us, and I remind you that on the panel are a member of the Commission, Parliamentary Reform, Ms. Maxine McLean, former Senator and Minister of Foreign Affairs, who will also share the panel with Mr. Braffett, whom I've already introduced as it were, former Attorney General, and Mr. Reginald Farley, currently President of the Senate and former Member of Parliament for Christchurch East. I don't know who is proposing to lead the sprint. He was pointing to you as knowing who will come first.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We wish to begin with, and my name is Mr. Corey Beckles, for those who do not know me, a member of the Parliamentary Reform Commission, and I thank the chair of the Parliamentary Reform Commission, Sir Richard Cheltenham, for his opening remarks. We want to continue by hearing from Mr. Adriel Brathwaite. Mr. Adriel Brathwaite, he will present for us. I see that there has been some communication between the panel, and it seems the President of the Senate, he will open the baton.
Thank you very much, and good evening. Let me thank the Commission for giving us the opportunity to participate. I've attended several of the meetings. I was away last week. I missed that one on the Senate and its future or lack thereof. So I didn't absent myself deliberately. I was just not in the country. But an opportunity to engage with members of the public in discussion on parliamentary reform is very, very important. My brief opening remarks will cover some of the backdrop to the cabinet, what it is, the question of greater accountability to the public, and where the initiatives be drawn from outside Parliament and so on. But to set some context, and let me also say I'm happy to share the panel with my two great friends. We were having some light banter before we began, and they said that is the context in which serious work should always be engaged upon. Some light banter to start. So, the matter of Parliament and Cabinet. First of all, these matters are all located within our Constitution. Our Constitution is our supreme law. And Barbados being a representative parliamentary democracy, our Constitution is the supreme law, and it sets out the framework and the arrangements for the government and governance of Barbados. And it is interesting to note that the chapters, there are not many, there are 10 chapters from my memory. Chapter 1, interpretation. Chapter 2 deals with the citizenship and head of state and coming down. There's an entire one for Parliament, there's one for the executive, there's one for the judiciary, the public service, finance, interpretation. And that tells you that these elements are some of the fundamental elements that make up the fabric of the governance of Barbados. Tonight we're dealing with two of them, Parliament and the executive powers as exercised by the Cabinet. So what does the Constitution say about the Cabinet? It says at section 64, there shall be a Cabinet of Barbados, which shall consist of the Prime Minister and not less than 5 other ministers appointed in accordance with the provisions of section 65. And it says in terms of its work, the Cabinet shall be the principal instrument of policy and shall be charged with the general direction and control of the government of Barbados and shall be collectively responsible, therefore, to Parliament. So the link and the relationship between Cabinet and Parliament is not a matter of choice, it is a matter of the duties set out in the Constitution. Cabinet is responsible to Parliament. Of course, this is all in keeping with the principles upon which our system of government and governance is based, which is largely still on Westminster principles, representative democracy, and so on and so on. Of course, the political scientists and experts will always make the point that one of the major differences between the day-by-day application of Westminster-style democratic principles, including and especially separation of powers between the executive and the legislature, is a matter of the size of the parliament. There, in the British Parliament, for example, you have a cabinet and you have a very large number of MPs because of the size of the country. In small countries, you need to have a cabinet to undertake to discharge the duties of general direction and control of the government, but the number of members of Parliament that you may have will be smaller because of a smaller population and smaller geography. And navigating that space has always been one that the purists have found difficult. The practitioners have not really found it that difficult, in truth and in fact, because what you have in practice is really at the level of the executive and the legislature, more of a fusion than a separation. And that in itself is a pragmatic, realistic approach to matters. And as I make some comments on that, I will let you know there are still tools, even within the limitation of small numbers and the relative size between the executive and the legislature. There are still tools that keep the executive on their toes, on their feet, and from time to time, in various parliaments across the Commonwealth, the executive has been overthrown. Not in any militaristic way, but the ability to bring an end, sometimes prematurely, to an executive that has lost the confidence of the parliament has been successfully achieved. And that, at the end of the day, is the ultimate check and balance. So that is, from a practitioner's perspective, how we've navigated that space of the separation. So the true separation really occurs between the legislature / executive, fully separated from the judiciary, some degrees of separation from the administrative arm, which though even falling under the executive, there are a number of guardrails and protections to ensure that there is a professional, independent, impartial public service to implement government policy and the choices that the executive has made, notwithstanding change in political administrations. And, you know, sometimes you have to, whether you're looking at the stock market performance and you see there's spikes on a daily basis and the market looks wild, over the long run, it looks so smooth and orderly. And sometimes if you step beyond the day-by-day issues, the problems of some departments not functioning as well as they could, the problems of relationships sometimes between ministers and departments, and that will happen at any day of the year from the time there was a cabinet or a public service. But if you look over time, Barbados has been able to show high degrees of social, economic, and political development because of a political class that was focused, committed, and worked hard, and a professional public service that delivered the goods, notwithstanding the blips along the way. But generally speaking, our services are reliable, our civil service or public servants have been extremely good. All now, there are a number of them who are working hard to implement the policies at this hour and on the weekends and so on. So let me speak now about cabinet. So that's some context. One of the very important principles of cabinet government and governance is the matter of collective responsibility. Now, collective responsibility really, to me, gives structure and coherence to our style of operations there. Here's what I'm talking about. Take the start of the process as the election cycle. A party puts out a manifesto, because in our system, we operate on a party basis. Not that independents are not welcome, not that you couldn't go as a standalone, but they're generally speaking, they're parties. A party sets out a series of draft programs. If you elect me, these are the things that I will do. That may find favor with the electorate, and those persons are elected. There's therefore, to me, a social compact. There is a relationship of trust that says, we elected you based on the people you put forward and our confidence in them, and the program that you outline. Yes, we know that the exigencies of the moment, if there's a world war, God forbid, or a catastrophic hurricane, it may cause a change in the planned program. But absent of that, this is what we elected you for. Having been elected, the cabinet is chosen. The leader of the political party, the person who enjoys the confidence of the majority of persons who won the government, becomes the prime minister and chooses the cabinet. And to answer one of the later questions early, the matter of whether the cabinet should be chosen only from those elected parliamentarians. Breaking news, in Barbados, for as long as there has been an independent Barbados, the cabinet has always included non-elected individuals. They're members of parliament through the Senate. I think some are asking the question, do we want to go the route of other democracies, like democracies which are more presidential style, where the president or the prime minister chooses their cabinet and they're not members of the parliament. That's an entirely different system of government and governance worthy of its own discussion. But within the context of the style of government and governance that we have, there's always been that flexibility. And in fact, if you follow the standing orders of the Senate, there are motions which can only be moved by a minister. So by definition, it is saying to you that there must be ministers in the Senate. But it also provides a prime minister who is ultimately charged with the cabinet with the responsibility of implementing policy, that they have a free hand to look beyond those persons that have been elected as constituency representatives to bring in other members of the society with particular expertise, particular whatever the Prime Minister may think is needed at the point in time, to head ministries and form the cabinet, and also ensuring that in both houses of the Parliament there are members of the executive present. So that mechanism is there. If there's a proposal to expand it, to go wider, but I think some folks who comment on these matters don't quite sometimes recognize that those persons, like for example, quite frankly, I did not run in the 1994 general election, but on the conclusion thereof, Prime Minister Arthur invited me to be Minister of Industry, Commerce and Business Development. Elizabeth Thompson, Liz, ran in 91 and 94, and she came through as a minister from the House of Assembly. I was a minister in the Senate. And therefore, it is possible to, under the system as it is now, to have members of the cabinet who are not limited to being members of the House of Assembly. And I would say that in unicameral chambers, for example, in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, where you have senators and elected members sitting in one chamber, that is a mechanism as well for Prime Minister there to be able to add to the cabinet from choosing from persons who were not candidates in the previous election. Now, collective responsibility is one of the principles that underpins cabinet government. And what is that all about? Collective responsibility is that we are all collectively, we are all together responsible for the policies, the ups and downs of the government, and we are all answerable to Parliament. We are answerable to the people through their representatives in Parliament. So, in a sense, Parliament and people in a representative democracy are synonymous. So, Parliament is the chamber in which it happens, and the representatives are there on behalf of their constituents, but ultimately, we're responsible to the people. Where collective responsibility is helpful, in my judgment, is that having gone to the public, to the electorate, with a set of proposals, having at the start of the parliamentary term had what was called the throne speech, that would now be the presidential or state speech, that sets out the government's plans and programs for the parliamentary term. And this is all part of the accountability. The Prime Minister and the Cabinet agree on that speech, and it sets out to the Parliament and through the Parliament to the people, this is what we propose to do out of our manifesto program in this term. The members of Parliament, the members of the public, are therefore able to hold the executive accountable for the achievement or non-achievement of those things set out in the presidential address at the start of the parliamentary term, what was once called the throne speech. For there to be discord, for there to be squabbles, for there to be wide and wild disagreements on policy openly, and for Minister 1 to be going in one direction, Minister 2 to be going in a third or fourth, is what in other countries you get where there's a band of individuals, I don't want to say masquerade, acting as a government, as opposed to in the cabinet system where we meet, yes, we disagree, but that dialectical approach where within the cabinet, before the decision is made, all of the options are explored. The Minister of Foreign Affairs may have an international perspective on a matter. He may highlight the international obligations which will be impacted by a local decision. The Minister of Finance will have a view on a matter based on the costs that might be incurred. The Minister for the social sector will have a view based on its impact on the poor and the disenfranchised, and we could go on and on and on. And it is out of that rich cauldron of diverse experience, backgrounds, and ministerial responsibilities that comes a consensus, comes a single perspective from the executive that is then translated into law, translated into policy, translated into action. And therefore, for coherence and for the government to be able to say, this is our position, collective responsibility means that a member of the cabinet who is so out of step or who fundamentally disagrees with the position of the cabinet after discussion does the principal thing of walking away or is otherwise relieved. But to me, it is not a constraint on free speech. It is not a constraint on ideas. We've all been members of cabinet, and we know what happens before the final decision is made. As a matter of fact, humility is the first requirement to be a member of cabinet. And why do I say that? Sometimes you have what you think is a brilliant idea. You go to your PS who thinks it's a brilliant idea. You draft a cabinet paper, the best cabinet paper since the papyrus and the quill, where the instruments are writing. And you go to cabinet, chest up, and you really feel smart. And sometimes a prime minister, as my prime minister used to, when you're going down the wrong road, he let you go all the way down. And then one by one, they start pointing out the flaws. Rapid discussion, heated discussion sometimes. But at the end of the day, you walk away from there with a decision that did not look anything like a first cousin of what you had originally proposed. But that is the collective view of cabinet, and you go up there and you champion that decision as if you were the progenitor. That is the nature of cabinet. Today you win, tomorrow you lose. But the richness, because we all in a cabinet come from diverse backgrounds, and I think the public is not able to see what happens behind the scenes, but it is really a great richness to our deliberations. The other principle that we have to bear in mind as we consider cabinet and its role and responsibilities of Parliament and the public, you also have individual responsibility. As an individual minister, you are responsible for what happens in your ministry, whether you know about it or not. So it is your business to know. You can't say, I didn't know. You're responsible. And you can therefore be called to account by Parliament. There have been examples across the Commonwealth, Barbados included, of no confidence motions being brought against individual ministers for actions in their ministries. They may not all succeed, but the very intense debate, the scrutiny, the information that comes out, the possible political damage to the image of the minister can have its impact. And those are, again, are some of the checks and balances. Now, in terms of that individual responsibility as the minister for the ministry, this is where things become interesting. In my assertion, my judgment, the minister is more of a leader than a manager in the ministry, because there is also, in the Constitution, the section on the public service. And there is a defined role for the permanent secretary as the accounting officer and the public service and how they're appointed and the degrees of separation. And in specific legislation, for example, the new Public Finance Management Act, there's even greater clarity given to these limitations of the role of the minister with respect to finances. And there are even sanctions that if, as a minister, you were to order the accounting officer, permanent secretary, to do something which is ill-advised and will cost the government money, and you're cautioned and warning by the officer that this will have this result, and you still proceed to instruct that this must be done, that you, as the minister, can be surcharged. You pay back the money. And of course, there are limitations in terms of personnel issues and so on. So that navigating that day-by-day relationship, how do I get the job done? And what is that job? Remember, from the state speech, from the throne speech, you have your set of of things to do as a minister responsible for area X or Y, and or topic, subject matter X or Y, and you have to show progress at the end of the day. So part of that responsibility then is building the relationship with your CEOs in your ministry, your board chairman, your permanent secretaries, and being an inspiring leader. What I used to do, just quickly as I wind up in this first pass the topic, I would go to the ministry and make a pact with PS and staff. I would say, listen, folks, I do not plan to do anything which would make you ashamed to say that you were at this ministry. And I will hope that you do the same for me. Let us all walk away from this tenure, be it long or short, with a ministry that is brighter, more efficient, more customer focused, that when you go someplace and you say where you work, people will hold their head up and say, oh yes, as opposed to holding their head down in shame. And together we found common ground. Our roles and responsibilities may have been different. We took charge of different aspects, but there was that common commitment towards advancing the goals. And the other thing I would say quickly is that the minister has a responsibility to provide clarity. Your role, or the minister's role, as a representative of cabinet, is to ensure that clear policy instructions are given. If you don't give a clear instruction, anything can happen. I saw in Selwyn Smith's, no, I think it was one of the former retired permanent secretary's book. He spoke about the introduction of free secondary education. And Cameron Trudeau was the Minister of Education at the time, I believe, and he went to his permanent secretary and said, well, you know, we have to do this is what we have to do. And the permanent secretary said to him, you have to instruct me. So I just told you. He said, no, you need to write me and instruct me to do this, and I will get it done for you. So that clear instructions, what are the goals of the ministry? And I would say that some of the interesting developments that are occurring within the Commonwealth, there's a program called Commitment for Results that takes some of the modern performance management principles used in the private sector, modified for government, that senior leaders, ministers, permanent secretaries, CEOs are using these principles. Stated clear vision, known mission, identified KPIs, key performance indicators for the given year, which include both qualitative and quantitative. So customer service, absence of customer complaints, included financial goals and so on. So everybody is clear at the beginning of the year, the beginning of the parliamentary term, of what you want to achieve at the end, rather than, you know, you read a manifesto, you know, just get on with it. And I think that those practices, in terms of the execution of the cabinet mandate, are as important as the development of the goals and the vision. So vision without works really does not get us anywhere. And as I close in this first part, I have much more to say, but I know that the time is short. In terms of increasing accountability, I've noted, for example, over time, the Parliament has expanded the role of various committees. So, for example, in the Finance Committee, which is a committee of the whole House, we now have this situation where, in addition to, in the estimates process, we have the opportunity for senior officers of ministries to be able, in the committee stage, to come and to discuss with parliamentarians, answer questions, explain positions, and to me that has been extremely useful as a means of giving that information to the public, because we as MPs, we are representatives of the people, and in Parliament, the executive reports to us, reports to the people through us. The other quick initiative that I would want to make mention is the recent establishment of standing committees, 4 standing committees, which rather than, previously the only standing committee was really Public Accounts Committee and the Finance Committee. And all the other committees were ad hoc on an issue-by-issue basis. But you now have committees which have oversight for major social and economic policy areas, and those committees can bring experts from the private sector, the NGO sector, and involve the public more fully in the work. And finally, this is one that, because we've had it for so long, sometimes goes unnoticed or unremarked upon. There are some people who lament, oh, you know, but we don't get crowds in the parliament anymore. And I wonder, is it because A.J. Bradford and Reginald Farley and Maxine McLean talking nonsense and nobody wants to hear them? They're forgetting that for many years now, 100.7 by CBC, I think they use 94.7 sometimes. There's a YouTube channel, there's a Parliament TV channel that you can stay where you are, from Timbuktu to wherever, and watch and listen. You don't have to do it live. You can go back tonight and check what happened in the House today. And that kind of open democracy where, yes, the representatives are there in the chamber to take the reports of the executive and to hold them account on your behalf. But you can also, as citizens, be active in our democracy by paying attention, and you can make your responses, because those of us in the parliamentary space, we're responsive. Public opinion matters. And as I close, I want to say that the cabinet function is an important function in the political structure of Barbados. Are there ways in which it can be improved? I'm sure there are. I would be happy to hear those. And I'm saying that within the parliament, even though there is not a large backbench, as you'll find in larger countries, that the same tools of parliamentary questions, private members' resolutions, no confidence motions, as well as making the grievances and concerns of the public known in the course of debate in the House, and having influence on the mood of the public and the electorate via the parliamentary space are still effective tools in holding the executive to account. I thank you for allowing me to make those introductory remarks.
Thank you, Senator Farley, for that presentation. We are speaking this evening on the role of ministers and their relationship with Parliament, and I thank you, Senator Farley, for opening with the presentation. At this time, I want to invite Adriel Brathwaite, Senior Counsel, former Attorney General. He will speak to us.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Let me begin by saying that being a cabinet minister is a very curious job, because it's the first job that you are head of an organization, you are a chief executive officer, and there is no training provided. You turn up, you're appointed, and you become chief executive officer. And I believe that that's where one of the areas where we can start in terms of reform, that we can ensure that, in fact, that persons who aspire for political office, that opportunities are made available to them. Now, for example, one thing that can be done is that if you have an opposition party or any political party who has an interest in gaining government, that in fact that they can appoint a shadow cabinet and ensure that those persons who aspire for political office can receive the requisite training, so that if and when there's a transition, that the learning curve is reduced significantly. The other side of the coin is also the only position that the chief executive officer isn't evaluated. And I believe that the time has come where, indeed, whether quarterly or yearly, that in fact that ministers are subjected by the Prime Minister to a review, as would happen if you were chief executive officer of any serious company in Barbados and across the world. A serious 360 review, and so that you're scrutinized and people have a good sense in terms of your performance. Now, I know that my friend Reggie mentioned that the estimates and what happens in the world presently. But again, if we are serious about making that transition so that ministers are truly made accountable, my experience was, and my experience is based on what I've seen over the years, that in fact that you do have the estimates, you present your policy, you present your budget for the year. It's interrogated in Parliament. It's passed if the requisite majority is there. But there's no analysis the following year in terms of how you perform during the year, of what happens to the monies that were given to you the year before. Because you come back the next year with a budget saying that you have policies that you want to implement and this is your budget. It is debated sometimes, or it may not be debated because you only have a week. You know, but you should be forced, if we are serious about making a difference, to in fact give an account of your stewardship for the year before you can come to ask for monies again for the following year. These are things that I'm serious about in terms of how we can improve our democratic processes and how we can improve accountability to Parliament. Yeah. And because it should not be a case where, because you're a minister or your ministry, that every year, come April, you submit your budget and away it goes. Because we all know that you probably do about 3 or 4 heads, during the course of the week. And lots of ministries are not touched and debate in terms of their policies and their initiatives, etc. So some mechanism must be put in place for that. And similarly, I believe that we need to move in the direction of having serious question and answer times in Parliament by ministers. I think the first step in terms of having officers being subjected to interrogation, and I use that word loosely, that in fact that it should be indeed the ministers, because it's the minister who comes to cabinet, it's the minister who comes to Parliament and say, I need X for my programs. So it should be the minister who has responsibility to account to Parliament for these programs and what they've done during the course of the year and what they hope to accomplish during the following year. As I said, we need to think out of the box a little bit here in terms of accountability and in terms of how we ensure that in fact that ministers are more aware of their responsibility. The public is more aware of what's happening within ministries, and the only way that can happen is if there's information flow. The question of whether or not you can have ministers from outside of Parliament. I know again the Constitution is very clear that indeed that you can have ministers. In fact, you must have ministers from within Parliament. Parliament, i.e. the House of Assembly and the Senate. So the real question is whether or not you can have persons who are not from Parliament who can be ministers, and if that's a good thing for Barbados. In other words, you might have someone who has very special skills. Let's say cybersecurity is a big issue, and we need a cybersecurity expert. You might have someone who might be interested in being the minister, or who the Prime Minister might be interested in appointing because for those particular skills. But that individual may have absolutely no interest in Parliament or parliamentary life. And that's why in some countries, that in fact that persons who are not members of Parliament and who are not required to be members of Parliament can become ministers. And according to my notes here, France, for example, Germany, and the Netherlands, that you need not be a member of Parliament, you need not even be a member of a particular party to be a minister. But of course, once you're a minister, regardless of whether or not you're a member of Parliament, and you should still held accountable, as I began in terms of being able to come into Parliament and accounting for your stewardship. So I've expanded from Reggie's presentation in terms of that, yes, that presently the Constitution does allow us to have ministers who are not elected. But I'm saying that in fact that we can, if we so desire, go further and have ministers who are not members of Parliament. Because in a small country like ours, you know, are we not robbing ourselves of being able to choose from the best brains available if, in fact, we have that tie that you either have to run for elective politics or be involved at the level of the Senate? It's just something worthy of consideration, you know, as far as I'm concerned. In terms of cabinet, cabinet has, and I believe this still obtains, and forgive me if I'm not correct, but cabinet does have the ability to have several subcommittees, and that's another area that in fact that we can use or we do use to ensure that more resources are available in terms of intellectual resources are available to the government. So because the subcommittee need not be made up only of ministers, that in fact that the subcommittee can bring in whatever resources it requires to assist them in terms of creating policy. In terms of creating policy, as you know, the responsibility of cabinet is in fact to all new policy initiatives nationally goes through Parliament. White papers, green papers, legislation, initiatives in terms of if you want to have an international conference, for example, here in Barbados, all these wide decisions are taken in Parliament. But Cabinet. But Cabinet meets once a week, usually. And you cannot get all of your work done within that framework, within, let's say, the Thursdays that we used to meet. And that's the strength of having the cabinet subcommittees, that they can tease out and interrogate initiatives. That legislatively, for example, that they can go through the legislation from top to bottom, look to see that the policy matches what is actually being drafted, so that by the time it comes into cabinet, that in fact that the ministers then can feel a bit more comfortable because in fact some of them are usually part of the subcommittee in any event, but it is less likely to have challenges when it reaches cabinet because in fact it's being subjected to a complete interrogation. And again, I said that's another tool for us to ensure that the best intellectual property available in Barbados is put to use within the cabinet framework. One of the issues that we've had, and we must face this as a country, is that from time to time, you would hear that ex-minister doesn't want to work with XPS because XPS is a supporter of the Barbados Labour Party or a supporter of the Democrat Labour Party, etc. And I think that as a country that we've been served by a very competent and professional civil service. The issue has been, and this is not generic to Barbados, the issue has been the style of the minister and whether or not the minister sees himself indeed as a chief executive officer and therefore he must be involved in all activities and the day-to-day activities of the ministry, which includes the departments attached to the ministry, or if he sees himself as a policy maker, and that in fact his role is to ensure, along with the permanent secretary and the senior officers, that in fact that the policy initiative that has been brought by him, that there's buy-in for it. And it's a question of style. My style is that I would have all the departments in the ministry at least once a year. We sit down so everyone knows what they're doing and what they're supposed to be doing. And then one-on-one, from time to time, I will meet with individual heads so that I can keep on top of what's happening from a policy perspective, not from a day-to-day perspective, because I saw my role as not the chief executive officer in that sense. This is what we're trying to accomplish, and you need buy-in. And that's, again, Reggie emphasized that in fact, that you cannot have buy-in if you don't explain to the members of your ministry what exactly you're trying to accomplish and how you're going to accomplish it. One of the lessons that I learned very early, and I'm grateful to the PS for it, is that PS Isaac Wharton called me and he said, "Minister, do you have a few minutes?" I said, "Yes, PS." She says, "Minister, my role is to ensure that whatever you want to accomplish within the laws of Barbados, that in fact, that once I can get it done for you, I will show you how it can be done." And I took her at her word, because with her vast experience and within the public service, I felt that I had no training. I never worked in the public service, so therefore I needed to rely on my PS. But of course the literature tells you that you have ministers who then the PSs don't get along. This, as I said, is not generic to Barbados. This is, internationally. This is in the UK, in Sweden, wherever. But you cannot get buy-in unless, of course, there's mutual respect and understanding. And that's why I began by speaking about training. Because if you have no training, you never know who's going to turn up and be a minister. There are no qualifications to be a minister. And indeed, in some countries, there are no job descriptions for the ministry. But that's a separate issue. So training is important, so that you then know how to transmit your requirements in terms of your policy initiatives, not just to the PS, but down to your ministry. So again, like Reggie, I just thought that I would touch on a few areas initially, and I'm sure that I'll come back. Thank you.
Thank you. We just heard from Adriel Brathwaite, Senior Counsel and former Attorney General. Now we turn to Ms. Maxine McLean, former Cabinet Minister.
Thank you very much. And I want to thank my two colleagues here. And I will start by refreshing our memories as to what we are doing, because I do not intend to rehash what was said by my colleagues, but in fact to refer to some of them. So just again to remind you, we are looking at the Cabinet of Barbados, the role of ministers and their relationship with Parliament, and we were asked to address some questions that have been posed. How can we achieve greater accountability to the public? And the second one is, should ministers be drawn from elected parliamentarians outside of the Parliament? What we had so far, and I will try to put my thoughts within the frame of what we've heard before. And I would suggest that Mr. Farley, I should say His Honor, as the young people say, respect due. Okay, says Reggie is the highest honor, so I will call you that after the meeting. Has given us a comprehensive overview of the constitutional framework within which Cabinet functions. And he defined critical features of Cabinet decision-making. And what I will do is to very quickly repeat a couple of things. And I do so from the perspective of being a member of the Parliamentary Reform Commission. So locating the Cabinet within the broader parliamentary system, that is within the framework of the terms of reference of the Parliamentary Reform Commission, we are required basically to examine the several elements of the parliamentary system. And as we know, three broad elements there: the legislature, in other words, the House and the Senate, the executive, the cabinet, and the judiciary. And secondly, I think that as we contextualize our discussions, we recognize, of course, that critical to our discussions is Barbados' new status as a republic. As we know, the shift from our status as a constitutional monarchy came on November 30th, 2021, when Barbados became a parliamentary republic. And so, with the abolition of the monarchy, we are now seeking to ensure that our systems are compatible with what we say we want as a republic. Reggie also, I said I was going to do it after, also stressed the context or the source of the power derived by Cabinet, and he cited Chapter 6 of the executive power of the Constitution, speaking to executive powers He also spoke to the selection, and I would want to reiterate a point made by my colleague and friend on my left here, Adriel Braffett, when he spoke about appointments outside of Parliament. And I think that is one of in terms of suggestions, because we had an overview, we had some suggestions, and I'll fall somewhere in the middle in a minute to talk about what it is to be a minister, or what my experience was. But the notion that we perhaps should contemplate where there is a level of highly specialized capabilities, skills, experience that we may contemplate doing as some other countries did, and we heard examples of some countries from Israel, that we may look beyond the elected, non-elected to non-associated, non-parliamentarian, because in the case of myself and Reginald did say that's how he started, we would have been appointed to the Senate and made ministers. But we are saying, what we are hearing as a recommendation, if we're talking about enhancing perhaps capacity, is moving towards a third kind of classification of appointments. So having said that, I want to say a little bit about my role as a minister. I was appointed first as a minister in the Prime Minister's office, but I spent pretty much most of my time as Minister of Foreign Affairs and Foreign Trade. And at the same time, I functioned as leader of government business in the Senate. And what that meant was, as Minister of Foreign Affairs and Foreign Trade, I had responsibility for, I would say, Barbados' face internationally as it related to foreign policy, but it was done within the context of foreign policy as it relates to domestic policy. And so, as a Minister of Foreign Affairs and Foreign Trade, you have an interesting relationship with your other ministerial colleagues, because your work in theory and in practice touches on the critical elements of policy, whether it is labor, it is trade, it is tourism, it is agriculture, it is social policy, because we engage as a country on what we call a bilateral and a multilateral basis, and therefore it was critical that as foreign minister you understood the nuances of, government policy as it related sectorally and so on. And so that was critical. The second aspect of my responsibility as it related to Parliament was that I was leader of government business. And what that required, according to the procedures, so to speak, was that I was required to pretty much often lead off debates. And I remember taking my first debate in the Senate was an estimates debate. And you are given 2 hours. Fortunately for me, and I see one of my former students right here, I had years of experience teaching. So to stand and speak for 2 hours and speak with substance and of substance was a little nerve-wracking. But as was suggested, in the absence of there was no formal training. You came into a system, and it so happened that the period of election coincided with a period in terms of the financial management of government, the whole estimate. So you're coming in at the end of a financial year. And so one of the things that what it really calls for is a level of, I mentioned humility, but also a level of fortitude or resilience. And so that was important. What I can say, though, however, in terms of my role in the Senate, because, as we heard, members of cabinet, other members of cabinet are drawn from the Senate, we also decided that it made sense, we being the members of the Senate, the government senators, that it made sense to expose colleagues to that role of leading off debates, and that worked very well because it allowed Barbadians to hear from my colleagues who had cabinet responsibility, their knowledge and expertise and whatever on these issues. And so that was important. I want to flip back to cabinet meetings because, as you heard, there was the whole issue of collective responsibility. But I want to say something about the question of the quality of decision-making. And Adriel mentioned it, and I made a note in red, that the committees that you spoke about did not exist when we came into office. We heard of standing committees in Parliament. But very early in the life of the David Thompson administration, there was an introduction of a series of cabinet committees. We had one on governance, chaired by the Attorney General. We had one on economic policy. We had one on social policy. We had one on infrastructure. And the rationale for that was that you started out in a situation where we were given on a Wednesday evening, sometimes after 4 o'clock, a pile of documents like this to go home, to digest, to come back and make decisions Thursday morning at 10 o'clock. Thursday's when cabinet, right? Yeah, Thursday morning at 10 o'clock. And it became clear that if you really wanted to participate in serious decisions, you needed to find a more efficient and effective way. And the purpose of those subcommittees was to channel serious, complex cabinet papers to a committee where, as you heard, we would have been able to bring together individuals from the ministry, technical persons inside and outside, people from the Solicitor General's office, you know, so that, and the Attorney General's chambers, so that we understood not only the what I would call the structure of a piece of legislation, but the policy that informed that legislation. And so in terms of operating as a cabinet, those committees were very critical to enhancing the quality of understanding at the individual and collective level, but also at the level of ensuring that when a piece of legislation went to Parliament, it was well scrutinized, and the chances of having to perhaps revisit a piece of legislation after it had been passed would have been you know, minimized. I'll quickly, and I would suggest to the Chair Corey that you can signal to me when my time is up. I also want quickly to say something about the Minister and policy implementation, again, something that was touched on. Very important there is that while a minister leads his or her ministry, you are actually supported by the permanent secretary and other public officers. My situation, because of my background, I came to government as a person with 17 and a half years full-time teaching and management across the spectrum of management. My first degree was in public administration. I had worked in the public service. I also would have served on corporate boards, etc. So taking that experience together, it was a plus, and if I were not careful, it could have been a minus, in the sense that not only did I see before me former students of mine, which was a good thing, but I also knew that in terms of experience and knowledge, I perhaps understood some issues, but I had to avoid overstepping what I would call the boundaries of the role of the minister and the role of his or her advisors. And at all times, the advice of the technical persons would have been important. I recall, and I use this as an anecdote, I recall one meeting, because I often had meetings with heads of department, etc. And somebody was explaining something, and I sat patiently. And then I said, maybe that's not it, it should be. And when I started to speak, I literally saw a young lady before me, her eyes opened up. And I said to her, yes, I know a little bit about these things. Because I think she didn't realize that I knew what we were talking about. But I think in terms of ensuring that there's a good relationship, the word humility was used, consultation, and accepting the perspectives of others is all that's so important. And I think generally in terms of perhaps improving, and since we had some of those suggestions from Mr. Braffett, what I would say is that a critical part of improving this process, and I want to touch on something Adriel said in terms of preparation. while traditionally political parties do have shadow cabinets and spokespersons, etc., the focus is speaking perhaps to policies that are in place, speaking and, to legislation that is being contemplated. I do not know the extent to which, and this was advice I gave to a young candidate back in the 90s when he was a student of mine, when he said he was interested in running for political office. And I said to him, one of the things that you need to do is to understand the workings of government. Because while you may be able to speak on tourism policy or agricultural policy or, problems in the health service or whatever the case may be, you need to understand the mechanics of the workings of government. And I would say, and I would stop on that, I think, because there's a chance to speak again, that for me, fortunately, what I took to my ministerial position, and I think that was perhaps why I was seen as somebody from the outside being brought into the Senate, was that I had multiple experiences across public and private sector, large business, small business, third sector. And so I would say to any person in this room who is contemplating a political life, I did not, and that's why I probably ended up in the Senate and stayed there. You need to take time to educate yourself. I say take personal responsibility to educate yourself about the issues which constitute the workings of our parliamentary system. I think I'll stop there because there may be other things I could say, but I'm sure we have in the audience persons who will want to raise questions, react, and you will probably want to hear some more from my colleagues. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Maxine McLean. Is there anyone in the audience who would wish to comment or ask a question?
Good evening. Good evening to the head panel and good evening to the commissioners. Pardon? Yeah. I have a few questions I would like to ask. My first question is to Senator Farley, and I'm wondering whether the Constitution should provide for a Prime Minister and a Cabinet to have a maximum number up to a specified number and not just only a minimum number. I can ask all the questions once and then sit down.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Okay. To Senator Farley again, or Mr. Braffett, is there a Barbados Cabinet handbook which outlines its rules and procedures? To Ms. McLean, there seems to be a disconnect between Cabinet and the citizenry as it relates to secrecy. And I'm wondering who keeps the Cabinet papers and where are they stored? After what period of time are they declassified and available for researchers to do review? For example, the public, I suspect, or researchers would like to know what happened after the October 6, 1976, the Cubana issue. To Mr. Braffett, and I have just two more. To Mr. Braffett, who advises the Cabinet on legal matters? If it is the Attorney General, will his advice be apolitical, non-political, given that the office holder is a partisan politician? And should the Attorney General have ministerial responsibility outside of being Attorney General, Minister of Legal Affairs and Justice? So, for example, should he really be responsible for the police? And finally, this could be to any member of the panel. Does Cabinet become subordinate to the dictates of a Prime Minister? And if so, why and in what circumstances? Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. No, I do not agree that there should be a maximum number for practical and pragmatic reasons. Legislation is passed at a point in time. You can only see what you can see at that point in time. And I like legislation which allows for the vagaries and vicissitudes of life. And I think that the ultimate check on the maximum will really be the people. If at the end of the day, you know, in a sense, governments can do what they consider prudent at a point in time. The public may not share that view, and the public has a way of dealing with what they consider to be imprudent. But I think that to hardwire legislation, especially the Constitution, that if circumstances required you to go beyond whatever that maximum. So suppose in the 1966 Constitution, it has said no more than 5 plus the Prime Minister, rather than no less than. Then in order to be able to deal with several of the issues, there have been certainly more than that from day one. One would then have to go and make amendments. So my own view is no, I would not have a maximum number. I think the system allows for prudence to be rewarded and imprudence to be punished.
Permit me to comment. Can I go ahead?
Yeah, you can go ahead.
Right.
Go ahead.
We have received, we being the Constitutional Review Commission, have received a couple of comments on this issue, and most of them actually has been about limiting the number of cabinet ministers. I, like Reggie, do not support that because you shouldn't hamper the ability of the Prime Minister to be reactive in terms of what the country requires at any point in time. But there's a school of thought that indeed that one thing that you can do is that you can specify the number of ministers that should come from the Senate, and in so doing, ensure hopefully that you would always have a number of backbenchers who, if they take their roles seriously, can in fact act as better interrogators to the minister, so that in fact that in so doing, when you have question and answer sessions, for example, hopefully you can have serious question and answer sessions because you have a larger number of backbenchers there who are eager to show their wares and show that they're worthy of moving forward. So that's something that we can always consider, but that is a recommendation that I've seen, that in fact that you should specify that we should have a certain number of ministers from the Senate. Sorry?
Okay, I think there was also a question about a cabinet handbook. There was none. We would have had an orientation, but when I've reviewed handbooks such as that of Australia and some other countries, a very comprehensive document, we don't have handbooks of those types. And so that clearly is something which can be very useful beyond any orientation and small, short documents to support some explanations of what you do. You also asked a question, I think, to me about cabinet papers. That was it? Yes. What I can tell you, and secrecy and what happens to them. When I was leaving the ministry, I would have taken with me, and they were packed up for me, minutes of cabinet meetings, not all the individual papers which came and so on, which really summarizes what would have happened. And I have those in my possession somewhere, which I won't tell you where to find them. But the important thing is those are documents which allow me to reflect on decisions that I made. But I will say this, I never took home files. And while I was a minister, my cabinet papers stayed in the cabinets of the Ministry of the Prime Minister's office in the first instance, and then the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Foreign Trade. It was on leaving that, as I said, I took possession of those documents that reflected the minutes of those meetings. And I think it is, well, you were asking about a time, declassification, I believe, but I would have to investigate the policy on that, and I would draw on the chairman and others in relation to that. There's also a question to you about advising the cabinet on legal matters.
Did you give a partial advice?
Thank you, panel.
Because
I trust, sir, that your
There was another
questions
question.
were
There was
answered.
another question about Attorney General.
Sorry, the simple answer to that is that if you're giving legal advice, you must give the best legal advice. It can't be along political lines. It's legal advice, it isn't political advice.
And the other question, the last question you asked about whether the cabinet is subject to the dictates or dictatorial perspective of a prime minister. I would say no, certainly not the one that they served in. Now, here is it. No. To emerge as a leader of a political party, you must, by definition, be the best and most successful political combatant of the period. I'm using it in a poetic sense, not in a derogatory sense, because you obviously have to be a person. Yes, you have the ability to formulate policy. You have the ability to communicate in the political space. You have the ability to inspire your members and have their confidence and so on. So clearly, a person who is a leader of that, with those characteristics, whether be it in business, be it in the media, be it in the cabinet, would be more successful than not in having their way. But to suggest that because the Prime Minister or the Prime Minister is, dictates, not in my experience, what I can say is this: all of us as cabinet ministers must go there with a clear understanding. If you didn't need my advice, Prime Minister, then you should not have appointed me. You give the advice. They may accept it or they may not. I've had instances where I put forward some views that were not accepted at the time. A week later, 2 weeks later, 3 months later, Prime Minister may come and say, colleagues, we have to do so and so and so and so and so. No reference to me, no mention, Skipper, you're right. But I would take that as my encouragement to continue to give my advice, give my view, give my country view, even if it is that. Even if at the moment in time, I may hold some political blows for it. And the final thing I would say is this: you have a sacred and solemn responsibility as a member of cabinet to go to work every day, willing to make that day your last. You cannot go there thinking, well, I go hold on to my little pick. And I think that the public notion that I sense, not from you, but going about there over the years, people somehow sense that we as politicians will do anything just to cling on, and that we were not doing any work before we became politicians, and we can't do anything after, and we just hanging on. I mean, joke. But I learned about job security from my father. Not by anything that he said, but my father was a carpenter, excellent carpenter. He would fix things that men couldn't get fixed. He never had a letter saying you're appointed to here in perpetuity. There was no services commissioner to protect him, no big elaborate legal thing. He worked for a firm and he did other private work. And it was his ability to get things done that he was so good that even when he reached the required retirement age, he said, Skipper, you don't have to go anywhere, He eventually came home at 72 after 60 years in the business. And that is security of tenure, where you have skills and knowledge that somebody is willing to pay for, willing to monetize those skills. So for me, I saw my responsibility and the opportunity to serve as I had a set of skills which the Prime Minister believed would be useful in the cabinet. He invited me to serve. He did not invite me to become what I was not before he invited me to serve. So the perspectives that I had before I would offer them, we will agree often, we may not agree other times. And like I said, it's a dialectical process. It's out of that dialectical process with everybody being who they are. Not seen as the Minister of Foreign Affairs would have an international perspective. It says that, folks, we cannot do this because we signed international agreement X or Y, or we will back this candidate for country Y because they'll back us in another candidacy. So I'm saying that to say that expect that a strong leader in business, politics, or anywhere would continue to be strong, and they will probably have greater success rather than less. We have strong trade unionists here who in their discussion, in their space, will tend to emerge because that is what brought them to the top in the first place. But that does not make them a dictator or make the others weak. And I served with Elizabeth Thompson. You couldn't want a stronger, a more robust fighter. And we had ways of resolving issues. But the short answer is, I like strong leaders. I think our country should have strong leaders. And I think really that in the business of leading the country with diverse interests, with diverse demographics, and in a turbulent world, I would rather have a leader who is at least able to win the thought battle, to be able to know when to give in to his colleagues, know when to take them to where they need to go. Moses got a rebellion from the people when he was leading them to the promised land because it took too long, and even on that holy mission, there was some rebellion, but he stayed firm. So no prime ministerial dictatorship. I was prepared to go to work any day to lose my job to save the country if it came to that. If a set of policies were being proposed that I think were not in the best interest, I would have resigned. So I used to tell my wife, if you see me come home early from cabinet today, it is because I chose to make a separate decision. And I think once everybody does that, and you enter the debate on the controversial issues, the contentious issues, but I've not experienced any situation in which we were ordered to take a position that we did not agree with.
Thank you. Is there anyone else who wishes to make a comment or answer a question? Thank you, sir.
Good evening, everyone. So the question there is there a way for greater accountability to the public? And I think we need to interrogate that some more, because I haven't really heard much in terms of how do we make the cabinet more accountable to the public and what are the mechanisms. Now, my friend Adriel mentioned one way perhaps is having that question and answer open to the public that ministers can then interact with the public. But how can we do that even more? My second question is, how does reshuffling a cabinet affect the cabinet? And how does that work? And we know that, as the question was asked about the Prime Minister being in charge and so on. But how does reshuffling a cabinet work, and is there need for discussion on that?
I would probably say a little bit about the issue of enhancing accountability, and perhaps you can, I will also hazard a guess as to what might happen in terms of major reshuffles having. But I think part of the issue of accountability has to do with the provision of serious information on not only the decisions, let's say, of cabinet, but on the impact and the outputs, the outcomes of those decisions. So in essence, we would have heard reference to what happens after funds have been allocated to a particular ministry, or to a set of initiatives, etc. So what is the reporting mechanism? I mean, we have had sessions where public servants report on the state of infrastructural investments and whatever else. But how is that information communicated to the public in a way that is properly digestible, that does not unnecessarily cloud your mind, over providing more information than you can properly absorb and so on. So I think part of it is communicating decisions, but more importantly, impact of those decisions and evaluation. There's an interesting, I had the opportunity to meet the the rule of Dubai. And there's a book he wrote, and this is one of the things he did with his cabinet. Every year, there was an evaluation of each ministry, and the results were posted on the outside of the ministry. So you could see, I mean, this is kind of extreme, but you could see, and I'll share the book with my colleagues so they can, of the commission, but you could see the performance. So you can imagine the feeling not only of the minister, because the minister is not the minister and the ministry staff. So there was, it's like saying to my son, if you do something wrong at school, I'm going to come to school and beat you. Because think of the humiliation, and I mean, that may have been extreme, but there was a process of evaluation and reporting, not only internally, but publicly. Accountability, when you speak of cabinet accountability, you also have to think, because cabinet essentially is responsible for policy. Implementation is by and large that of the public officials, the administration. So when you talk about accountability, and I'll stop at this, it has to, in order to speak to the accountability of the cabinet, that is to the individual and member and collectively, you also have to have a systematic way of evaluating the process of implementing of those decisions. And I think that has to factor in there, because it isn't something that happens, ministers waving a wand and getting things done. So that accountability has to move along the entire decision-making and implementation process.
Just a couple of things. One, there should be very few secrets in terms of in government. And therefore, I look forward for us to indeed enact freedom of information legislation. I know the public believes that, in fact, that government wants to hide everything, etc. And that will go a long way to appeasing those, those individuals in particular who believe that in fact, that government is hiding things all the time. And of course, if you have more discussions, one of the responsibilities of a minister, for example, I believe, is not only to ensure that his policy is transmitted correctly and effectively down through his ministry, but in fact to the public. So he can use opportunities when he meets the press to engage them. Just like how the press will come with their agenda, with their questions, you can go to them, with your policy initiatives and share with them, and hopefully that way they can be conduit between you and the populace. Yeah. So, the issue in terms of reshuffles, just like the choice of ministers is purely the prerogative of the Prime Minister. Ironically, this afternoon in my reading, one of the sections that I read was a comment in terms of the number of reshuffles that they've had in the United Kingdom over the last 10 to 12 years. Mm-hmm. And I think the author suggested that indeed that the frequency of the reshuffles have inhibited ministers to effectively implement their policies, because on average ministers were serving for just over 2 years. Mm-hmm. and it probably takes about 2 years to get your legislation, get your policy in place so that you can champion it. So that's the other side of the coin, that in fact you shouldn't just reshuffle for the sake of reshuffling. It must be some rhyme or reason other than the fact that the media determines that well, we haven't had a reshuffle recently. Why have we had a reshuffle?
Thank you very much to the panel, and also to Sulman Bulbulia for the question. He is also a member of the Constitutional Reform Committee, and we thank you for joining us this evening. I want to read a comment from Mr. Moore, David Moore, and the comment is: the structure of government will have to be modernized for the new republic. And perhaps the Constitution may need to be tweaked a bit, with full public consultation and surveys being carried out. Also, greater community participation with full representation from each parish, a council of elders perhaps, actively playing a role in some of the decision making. I just want to read that again. The structure of government will have to be modernized for the new republic, and perhaps the Constitution may need to be tweaked a bit, with full public consultation and surveys being carried out also. Greater community participation with full representation from each parish, a council of elders perhaps, actively playing a role in some of the decision making. The panel need not respond, but if you so desire, you can to that comment. All right. And unless there are any other persons in the audience who wish to comment.
Yes.
Well, Mr. De Carey's makes is I just want to say that some of the things that were suggested by the WhatsApper will not necessarily need a change in structure of government. Just an embracing and use of the modern tools. So, for example, surveys. I mean, there's SurveyMonkey, there's this, there's that. There are a lot of interactive tools where we can, without having to change any structural elements, have a more participatory democracy, both at the parliamentary level, as well as on the community level, and even in terms of government departments. In terms of delivery of service, government departments need to be bold enough to invite and make it easy for clients, for citizens, to give feedback on service or lack thereof. Because you can only fix a problem if you know the problem exists. So if it was running a restaurant, I would rather have things in place that the customers could tell me that my food tastes a little bad, and they could fix it when there's only a few customers making that comment, that it goes and goes and goes. So I think sometimes we as government, we sometimes do not take on that customer focus and kind of earn their ongoing support, because we're providing a regulatory service. Yes, but we need to do it in a way that brings satisfaction. So I'll take some suggestions there, but a lot of it can be done without having to change structure to make it more participatory and easy for citizens to make their inputs. Sorry, Mr. Carries.
Thank you. Trying to address the objectives written up on the screen there. One comment and maybe a question. The issue of non-parliamentarians being in the cabinet, I would support, obviously with a limitation, maybe 10% or 2 people. I think the objective of getting specialized help from people who are not particularly interested in going into Senate or into Parliament, and unfortunately, from an external perspective, the attractiveness of both the Senate and Parliament is not particularly great from an external perspective. I don't know how parliamentarians see themselves in terms of the perception of people in other parts of the community. Sorry.
Not here.
And if I go any closer, I'll be eating it.
Oh, yes, yes, much better.
Okay, so maybe just to repeat very quickly, I'm in support of having up to maybe 10% of the cabinet being external people, that you can get the resources into an important decision-making body, but without the elaborate procedures of going through Parliament and the Senate. The second one is really a question for our esteemed panel. The issue of accountability comes up in many, many ways. I actually think in Barbados we have a very, very serious challenge with accountability. And the issue really is accountability is providing an account. So when you provide the account, what happens then? And the Kadir sort of mentality is very prevalent, and in fact, in many cases, and this runs right through the private sector, so they're not exempt from this sort of feeling. Nothing actually happens, and the more senior you go, the less something happens. So the question I have of the three ex-cabinet ministers, what actions are available and to whom in order to hold cabinet members accountable? Thank you.
Thank you.
I would probably have preferred a little more specificity in the last part of the question. But what action is taken for someone being held accountable, which is a very broad term. Sometimes when people say someone should be held accountable, they may lock them up, or they may mean public shaming, or give them a slap around the head, but it all depends on what is the offense. Now, clearly, in terms of, and you ask what actions can be taken by whom? The first action, of course, for ministers who breach any code of conduct, or as we used to say, the final school rule is always a breach of common sense is a breach of the school rules. Is also a breach of common sense is also a breach of cabinet rules. And the Prime Minister has the opportunity and the responsibility to relieve that burden from the public if it should come to that. But then if you're talking about breaches of the law, then there is the usual recourse. Commissioner of Police, Director of Public Prosecutions. What I would say is this, though, that you hear a lot of talk in Barbados about things, whether it be on a village level with a neighbor or in a workplace somewhere. And I'm not a lawyer, but the one thing that I've learned by sitting close to lawyers is this, that information is not evidence. Information can lead to evidence. It is why we're accountants, Chris, and if you have yes, every accountant can do certain investigation and so on, but if you have a problem and you really suspect that there's some criminal stuff, you need to get a forensic accountant to come in to generate the information that, based on their additional special training they know, would stand up in court. There are situations where, in relation to public officers, you may tell somebody will call you and tell you, look, John Brown asked me for so-and-so, for so-and-so. But that person, that complainant, is not willing to go to a police station and say, my name is Tom Smith. I live at, Culpeper Island. And on the 18th of June, so-and-so in Department X made this improper suggestion to me. And that is what really is needed to trigger some of the level of quote-unquote accountability that is being asked about. What I can say is this, though. There is another side of all that, and that is that if we can put a lot of systems in place which are preventive in nature. So, for example, if our public services run well, so you know that before you go down to Department X, you need 5 pieces of information, and when you go there, you don't have to beg a favor or otherwise create inducements to get the thing done. If we can do more of our stuff online, and once you're entitled to this, it is very clear, then it reduces the temptation for any reverse incentivization. So for me, my view has always been that one of the things to do on our list always must be to have as one of the policy requirements of our ministry for our officers to find ways of simplifying things, to put certainty and to remove uncertainty, to ensure that the public is able to get the services that they're entitled to. And in fact, I used to say to people as they did investment promotion tours in Barbados and overseas, so if you see me somewhere, shout me. If you see me in the shipping having a drink, shout me. But you do not need to come through me to get the incentives that concern you. I'm not in that. You don't need any special arrangements with me. All of what you are entitled to is there in the law, and your accounting firm, your attorneys, whatever, go through due process. So I used to declare up front what my position was at that time and still is. So due to the lack of specifics in your question, Chris, I'm just stating some general principles really which that our systems in government need to be more certain, where one does not have to ask anyone, whether they be a clerical officer somewhere or a minister, to facilitate a process that should be easy and automatic and human-proof, and that where people do, in fact, match the crease, because those are things that cause a loss of confidence in the public concerning their ability to get their just due and to get their services done, that we should apply all of the sanctions which are available, from relief from the duties to any other sanctions that the law would allow.
If I might speak to that, because like Reggie, you were not specific, and therefore if you're talking about accountability, I think what I was trying to capture your words, what actions are available and to whom? Actions in relation to what? Illegal activity on the part of a minister? Are you talking about poor performance? No, I want to say, because I have had the opportunity to sit on both sides of the fence as a private sector, as you are, because we tend to hear these things. And I want to start with illegal activity. And the question is, when we talk about accountability, in the same way that I mentioned that when we're talking about performance, we also have to recognize implementation is part of the final outcome. And therefore, the two sides to the coin is that who's also going to hold accountable the other partner to the crime. Let me look at it that way. Poor performance, as you said, you can be asked to exit the cabinet. Poor performance as an MP, you'll be asked to exit the constituency or whatever the case may be. But I have a difficulty sometimes with the notion that somehow these cabinet members or these politicians or these MPs or whatever are actors out there by themselves and of themselves, getting involved in tainted behaviors and whatever, when in fact it is. So my whole question of accountability has to do with both sides of the coin. I'll give you an example in terms of my ministerial responsibility. In my first 11 months, I was responsible for immigration at a time when we had a lot of problems. But I had said to my permanent secretary, before I leave here, I want to lock up one of the employers who was holding on to passports, holding on to salaries, and treating illegal immigrants in very shabby ways because they know they did not have the recourse to the Labor Department and so on. So the point I'm making is there are two sides to a coin. And so when we say that, you know, there's a point in the fingers at the politician or the cabinet member, but as I said, we have to understand. Reference was made to 360 evaluation. Let me say we need a 360 when we talk about accountability as well, and that's important. And the point was made that in terms of what I would call the internal aspect of it, meaning performance on the job and so on, outside of matters illegal, that is the purview of the Prime Minister, who appoints, and the word they like to use is appoints and disappoints.
Thank you. There is a presentation from Peter Wickham, and at this point in time, we want to hear that presentation.
Hi, my name is Peter Wickham, and I just wanted to add my voice to this whole matter of the role of the cabinet. I have a simple concern. We have a principle called collective responsibility that says that cabinet members are collectively responsible. And we also have a principle that suggests that the lower house should scrutinize the work of the executive, which is one of the principles enshrined in our Westminster system of government. My concern is that the tradition in Barbados, as is the case across the Caribbean, is that the size of the cabinet makes this impractical. So whether it be the current Mia-Motley administration, which has a large cabinet, or alternatively the previous Frando Stewart administration, which had effectively included all of the sitting members in the cabinet, you have a situation where the backbench is unable to supervise effectively the work of the executive simply because the cabinet ultimately takes into consideration virtually the entire backbench, either now or alternatively the backbench that was on the side of government in the previous administration. So the proposal is basically that we look at a constitutional limit on the size of the cabinet. This is done in the Cayman Islands, where there's a constitutional limit placed, so that at all points in time, the backbench would cumulatively be able to run an effective check on Parliament in much the same way that it would have been in 1994, when we had effectively a recall of the leadership through Parliament working and scrutiny. That's essentially my only concern. I think that we should consider placing a constitutional limitation on the size of the cabinet so that regardless of who the Prime Minister is, that person would be precluded from making the cabinet so large that it threatens the ability of Parliament to scrutinize the work of the executive. Thank you very much.
To the panel, there were some questions that were sent to your WhatsApps. I would invite you to look at them now, but I want to remind the audience, those who have joined with us online, of the terms of reference of the Parliamentary Reform Commission. And one such term is to examine, consider, and inquire into the parliamentary system, process and procedures, and all other related laws and matters with a view to making recommendations for the strengthening of Parliament and its functions. The aim is to enlarge and strengthen democracy and to reflect the wishes of the people of Barbados as they seek to take full ownership of national institutions and processes in the construction of a culturally relevant, inclusive, and modern nation state that reflects the Barbados' republican status. And that's just one of the terms of reference for the Parliamentary Reform Commission. Before the panel continues, we have some questions from some members of the Parliamentary Reform Commission. I want to invite Dr. Chandler to answer these questions.
Thank you, Commissioner Beckles. My question to the former Attorney General is, can you please explain to the public the relationship between the Attorney General and the Solicitor General? Because at some of our meetings, we've had presentations about there needing to be an independent Attorney General, and even at this meeting about the Attorney General's office being too political. In the Attorney General's office, there are various independent offices over which the Attorney General superintends, and I think a person with your experience will be able to explain that. And in relation to the comment on the cap on number of cabinet, many presentations to the Commission so far have contained a recommended cap on the number of ministers in the cabinet. So my question to the entire panel is, given the fact that in the rest of the Commonwealth, there is a distinction made between cabinet ministers and non-cabinet ministers, would the same obtain in Barbados, in your estimation, if there were a cap on cabinet? And the third question is one that is not as sexy as the other ones, but is one that is equally important. The Constitution, Section 107, establishes the Consolidated Fund. 108 mandates that the Minister of Finance lay the estimates before the House of Assembly. And 109 gives Parliament the authority to authorize, through the House of Assembly, the appropriation bill, and mandates that the Minister of Finance lay the appropriation bill. Can you comment, please, on the relationship between Cabinet and Parliament over the control of public finances, and whether the exclusion of the Senate from dealing with money bills, and if one of you can explain a money bill, whether that is a hindrance to Parliament's oversight over Cabinet and the public administration of funds?
Yes. I'll take the easier question. The Office of the Attorney General is just not the legal advice to Cabinet. In any event, the Attorney General will naturally need support, and that's where the Office of the Solicitor General, because just really not just advice to Cabinet, it's the government's chief legal office, although the Attorney General is considered to be the chief legal officer, so that any claims against government, for example, are dealt with by the Solicitor General, by the Solicitor General's office, which is headed by the Solicitor General. And of course, then you have the Chief Parliamentary Counsel's Office, which is responsible for the drafting of legislation. And the Office of the Attorney General, you have the other departments. And mention was made by my friend earlier about whether or not the Attorney General should be responsible for the police, for example. So there are other offices, but that in essence is why it's a difference. The Attorney General, yes, is considered to be government's chief legal officer, but the supporting mechanism is, of course, the fact that you need staff to assist you and being able to render that advice. And that's the remit of the Solicitor General's office.
I'm trying to understand the matter. I was trying in terms of the consolidated fund. If you could walk me through that again. I pulled up my constitution to follow. I walked with it.
Thank you, Commissioner McLean. So the consolidated fund is supposed to be the bank account of the government for the most part. Right. And you have the revenues in a consolidated fund, and the expenditure comes from the consolidated fund. The Minister of Finance under the Constitution is mandated to lay before the House of Assembly the estimates, which are the financial projections. And then the Minister of Finance is also mandated to lay an appropriation bill, which is supposed to be asking the House of Assembly for permission to use funds from the consolidated fund to spend on public services. The House of Assembly, essentially, if you read the Constitution, has authority over the final say of the use of public funds, but it is Cabinet that makes a proposal to Parliament through the House of Assembly for the use of funds. And the Senate itself is excluded from commentary unless it's a resolution, but not for the passage of the bill, of a money bill. So given that there are at least 2 people on the panel with experience on the Senate, I'm wondering about your opinion in relation to the Senate's exclusion from a debate of money bills in terms of its passage, and the relationship between Parliament and Cabinet in relation to control over the public purse.
Okay, let me start with the issue of the debate on money bills in the Senate. The notion of a debate is that having debated, the bill does not pass unless it passes the Senate, right? Not with another bill. A regular piece of legislation goes before the House of Assembly, is debated, and sent to the Senate, where it is debated and passed. Now, the Senate is appointed, and there has been a position, long-standing tradition position, call it whatever you will, that there is no taxation without representation. In other words, you are not voted for, and therefore you do not effectively have a voice in determining, taxation, because at the end of the day, the traditional mechanism for raising the funds to finance the projects, etc., that are covered in those things come through taxation of some form or other. And therefore, the argument was nobody chose you, nobody voted for you, and therefore this is an area in which you perhaps have no say. Now, of course, in the estimates part of it, that goes to the Senate, and persons can speak to the programs, etc., of those things, and perhaps the rationale for us allocating X amount of resources. So there's discourse, there's debate, discussion on that, but you don't ultimately have a say in what monies will be allocated to address those things. And if I believe we have not only a former senator, but a current president of the Senate, if there's anything you want to add, sir, to...
No, I don't think so.
Okay, and he's also an accountant. But he says I'm correct. But I think that is the basis of it. The other question you asked was, and pardon me, I'm a little slow, I'm a little older than you are. In terms of cabinet, you mentioned cabinet and...
So, in terms of the House of Assembly and Cabinet's control over the purse, and the House of Assembly's mandate to approve the expenditure, does any person on the panel consider there to be an imbalance right now in relation to the role of Parliament in controlling the expenditure of the public funds?
When you say an imbalance, an imbalance brought about by what? The numbers of persons who sit in cabinet versus the others remain? I'm trying
Well,
to...
the House of Assembly is dominated by cabinet, and the House of Assembly is supposed to approve the appropriation bill brought to it by cabinet. So I'm just wondering, and I'm not leading you in any direction, just wondering if there is an imbalance.
I think one of my fellow commissioners, she's looking to have a comment, and perhaps Ambassador Thompson, I saw you pull your microphone a little close. So.
I did indeed, but not to engage with Dr. Chandler.
I think that is basically in the same way I believe that you have to function it's a kind of fused situation as minister and MP, and so I think as cabinet member and MP, you have, I suppose you may say, how do you go against something that you decided in terms of allocation? I need to think on that one a little bit, to be quite honest. So I would stick a pin there, and as I used to tell my students, if I don't have the answer immediately, I'll get back to you.
So I did pull my microphone. I'm just going to remind Messrs. Brathwaite and Farley that I didn't see Ms. McLean's, Commissioner McLean's WhatsApp having 2 ticks, but the questions that have been coming in, I sent them to your phones, that's why I'm on the phone, fielding the questions. And while you're looking at those, I want to ask a few questions. Would you please make it clear, I'm going to ask this of the former AG, what is the distinction, and I don't think it was made clear, I think that the panel assumed that people understand, what is the role of a permanent secretary versus what is the role of a minister? You hear all the time things like politicians dipping their hands in people money, as if politicians have access to the management and accounting systems or the accounts of the ministry. So I'd like that explanation, the explanation of the distinction between the role of ministers and the role of permanent secretaries. To His Honor, who is an accountant, every year much is made of the report of the Auditor General and negative comments on the management, the financial management of the ministries. Invariably, it is attributed to corruption on the part of the political class. In my experience as a minister, the negative comments in the Auditor General's reports really come out of management issues. And I'm going to give a typical example because very often I don't think people understand, and I was hoping that you would explain the process and what happens and so on. To give the example, let us say that you have a business selling food, a retail business. So let's call it Best Foods Barbados Limited. Best Foods Barbados Limited has an arrangement, it has been agreed with the ministry, the permanent secretary. They've gone through a bidding process. They've got the best bids, and they have agreed, the ministry has agreed, a committee has been established to review the bids, to let's say supply the schools with with lunch, with school meals. Let's just say that as an example. And the contract has not yet been written up by the Solicitor General's chambers. But the school term is starting, and the school children need food. So invariably the permanent secretary or somebody who is head of the department will say to Best Foods, well, look, you're getting the contract, that has been agreed, but the contract is not ready. Go ahead and supply the schools, because Monday morning the children are going into school, and if they don't get any meals, that is going to be a problem. The children cannot go hungry. That will appear in the Auditor General's report as a breach because there was no physical contract, no legal contract in place that was signed at the time. So then you would hear somebody say, wait, so how big fools get that big contract then, and where all the money disappear to, and so on and so forth. And literally it is that kind of thing that appears in the Auditor General's reports. But I don't want to preempt you. I'm sure you have your own interesting examples. But I really think that we need to explain to the public the practical inner workings of the cabinet and the accounting systems and the checks and balances which take place, because I don't think that they are fully understood or appreciated, and particularly the comments that emanate from the Auditor General's reports all the time.
So let's recap in terms of what is the role of a government minister. I can list 4 broad areas. One, parliamentary. One of his responsibilities is to ensure legislatively that if there are any initiative that they're channeled through Parliament, he wants to, of course, he wants, if it's in his best interest, to have a good relationship with his fellow parliamentarians so that it makes his life easier in terms of having things done within a parliamentary framework. He is considered to be, as I said earlier, the chief executive officer in terms of policy framework within the ministry and the departments that fall under that ministry. He wants to keep an eye to see that the policy initiatives that is created by him as minister that they're carried out. So that's his policy, executive inverted commas policy. He has responsibility for his departments. During estimates, for example, he has a responsibility to ensure that as much resources is made available to his particular departments as possible. So if you have police and fire and post office, etc., you want to advocate for them with the Minister of Finance and ultimately with the Prime Minister to ensure that the resources are made available. And of course, as was said earlier, in terms of collective responsibility, that's also part of your remit as Minister, to ensure that that's not breached. And then finally, you're obviously an advocate for your policies, and that's why I mentioned to my friend earlier in particular that the relationship between the press and the minister can be two-way, that in fact that you can use the press also as your vehicle to get your message out there in terms of your public advocacy for support for your policies, right? But but the day-to-day functioning of the ministry, I remember that in one of my earlier presentations, I mentioned that the conflict sometimes between the minister and the permanent secretary, not just in Barbados, but elsewhere in terms of where does the minister's responsibility begin and where does it end. The permanent secretary is, in particular, the chief financial officer, chief accounting officer of the ministry. So contrary to what some people might believe and maliciously state, that in fact that no funds passes through the minister's hands. No checks are signed by the minister, no drafts are issued by the minister, no wire transfers are done by the minister, etc. Usually, as minister, if you want to check on how programs are doing, you sit down with the PS or you call the PS, say, PS, can we afford this? Because that's what the PS does, not the minister. But as I said, sometimes, you have this territorial, and in fact, I remember when I went when I first became AG, the staff were told, you are not to approach the minister. Any approaches to the minister must be done through me as PS. But I changed all of that because you really can't expect people to work for you and don't interact with them. But I hope that's simple enough for everyone to follow. that in fact that the day-to-day workings of the ministry is usually dealt with by the PS and the staff there. The minister drives policy.
Thank you very much. Answering the question from Senator Thompson concerning the Auditor General's report. First of all, it's a very important part of accountability for public financial management. Public financial management is a new Public Finance Management Act 2018 and 19, I believe, which replaced the Financial Management and Audit Act and other legislation, but along the same lines. That has actually clarified or reinforced, I should say, a number of roles. The roles of the permanent secretaries, the chief financial officers are clearly specified. It has settled a governance framework for the state-owned enterprises, outlining the role of the chairman, the chief executive officers, and the ministers responsible for those state-owned enterprises. There's a specific role for the Minister of Finance, who interacts with those entities and so on. Now, the work of the Auditor General as that independent public officer that reviews the work of government departments or any enterprises in which government has an interest is twofold: financial audits and value for money audits. So from time to time, you will see a special report of the Auditor General on a project or an enterprise to look at value for money. Is it achieving what it was set out to do? And that is the direction that Auditors General around the world are moving to in large measure. Now, one of the challenges from a very technical point of view with the audits and the Auditor General's, well, not the report, but the audit process in Barbados, is that under the Public Finance Act of 2006-7, around there, we adopted some standards called the International Public Sector Accounting Standards, IPSAS, as the accounting standard for Barbados. And that required that we move from the traditional cash accounting to what is called accrual accounting. And before getting too technical, just to say that the way that the same transaction is treated may be different in cash versus accrual. So in basic cash accounting with government, you account for all your monies coming in, all your money's going out, and you were good to go. With the new standard, you have what, for example, we call revenue recognition methods, and you have to apply your revenue in a certain way. You have to make estimates of expected losses, revenues that you may not collect. You have to put the valuation of your assets in place. So you have to value roadways, public cemeteries, public parks, and so on and so on. So there's a whole of government approach. So central government plus the statutory entities should be able, in a perfect world, to give you a good valuation of what the government's assets and liabilities and so on are, apart from the actual money that is being spent. Now, in the audit process, auditors have rules to follow, and audit could only be done properly following the audit rules. And the Auditor General follows the ISOTI, International Supreme Audit Organizations, or whatever that body is called. They have their own Auditors General international body, their rules, their annual conferences, there's training. And just as the case with private sector auditors and people running companies, the two are in the same space, but sometimes operating, how should I say? Let me put it a different way. If you're following the accounting standards, so the Auditor General, given that the law says IPSAS is the order of the day, all of his audit and his analysis of what is before him, does it conform to IPSAS or it does not? So before any money being stolen, before anything going wrong, you could be incorrectly recording the information from an accounting perspective. So in the old cash system, maybe you bought a small item, a $3,000 photocopier, and you might expense that one time. I bought it this year, it appears this year as an expense. Under these new rules, it may be that an accounting policy says, we will treat things under $1,000 as cash items, we buy them, we put them in the same year. Things over 3 years, things over $1,000 salary, we amortize. And you have to follow those rules. So the money is safe, it's gone where it's supposed to go, but just recording it incorrectly is a point the auditor has to flag as incorrect. The failure to do bank reconciliations or do them in a timely and a consistent manner. A lot of technical flaws, unfortunately, still occur. And the other big one that occurs, there was no audit information. Now, the Auditor General has to walk by sight and not faith. Your private auditor of your company, no matter if he went to school with you, if you all play on the same cricket team, and according to modern rules, he will probably recuse himself because there'll be a conflict as far as independence is concerned. So, yes, we know that PS so-and-so or Chief Financial Officer so-and-so is a good and honorable person. But if the Auditor General says, listen, I need to see the documentation that shows the approval of this travel by the environmental officer to the conference. He's gone, the travel agent has been paid, the money isn't gone into cyberspace, you know. But the officer did not produce the cabinet approval or whatever. The Auditor General could only say that there is no evidence of this having been approved. He cannot walk by your say-so. So a lot of the things that are listed as unaccounted for, not explained, not supported by evidence, sometimes the officers come a day after the deadline and send it in. You haven't seen it. So there are a lot of technical issues, but that said, there's hope. Wearing my other hat as ICAB, I know that ICAB over many years has been working closely with the Auditor General's Department, the Accountant General's Department, the Ministry of Finance. We've done lots of training for public finance managers over the years, training in the International Public Sector Accounting Standards, IPSAS. We've done a lot of other training as well. We've also encouraged the government, and successive governments have increased the hiring of chartered accountants, qualified chartered accountants in the public service. These days, you cannot be a financial controller unless you have the chartered designation. Years ago, people held those positions based on experience as a government accountant, so that the auditors have better prepared material to work on and from. The other missing piece was this. There is something called an accounting policy manual. That is, how do I, within my company, treat certain expenses and certain accounting? How do I account for large purchase inventory, assets, and so on? And the government, for a while, did not have a full one in place in terms of the Accountant General's office. I believe that's been completed, but in the absence of that, the Auditor General staff had their view on how items should be treated, and staff in the ministries had their view of how they should be treated from the accounting point of view. So, separate from any situations where there may be people doing the wrong thing in terms of the traditional view of right and wrong, there's been a lot of cases where, from a technical point of view, there's not been consistency in terms of following all of the accounting procedures that the people working in accounts and working in the compliance areas, making sure, for example, we had a situation where there's a requirement to have people who are getting government pensions produce a life certificate every 6 months, I believe, to confirm that they're still operating in this realm of the flesh. And that was not done consistently at some point, and that obviously is a red flag, because it could mean that someone has transitioned to the spiritual realm. They've gone to meet their maker, but yet their pensions either are or could potentially have been paid. I mean, yes, the monies may be recovered after the fact, but those are technical violations which, between the new legislation, continued training for public officers is working to correct. Unfortunately, that is the one area, or those things are the one area, which, even though the minister, as a member of cabinet, is responsible for his ministry, he has no control, cannot tell anybody, do this or that. You cannot tell an officer how to write a receipt, what to write it for. You can give no directions of a financial nature. But yet, when the Auditor General's report comes out, you're responsible because it happened under your watch, it happened under your ministry. And it's one of those areas we have to look at. Finally, I will say this. Over the last many years, at the cabinet level, the cabinet has, when the Auditor General report comes out, directed that the accounting officers, the PS and the chief financial officers, write responses to the matters flagged by Auditor General. Those responses, however, do not usually get the same level of press coverage as does the Auditor General's report. There is a perspective which I heard a member of the press articulate. I'm not saying that that's the overall view, but I can understand it. There's a view that good news is PR. If you want it out there, you pay or you undertake your own PR. Bad news is public interest. And therefore, we will circulate your bad news for free, but your good news, you need to work on the PR. But take it wrong, you find it right. As successive governments at the level of cabinet, we have not always understood how communication and the news media and so on works. I listen to Parliament, I've listened to Parliament over the years when I've been in it and when I've not been in it. I'm just strange that way. You know, but over the years I've listened. And many ministers over many years in parliaments have made lots of statements. They have explained things going on in the ministry. They have given context to legislation that is before them, things that they're going to change. And the reality is this, when you read the newspaper the day after or 2 days after, and they will say quite reasonably that they cannot cover everything. Well, fine. But sometimes the things that get covered are those which are, in their judgment, newsworthy. They're more sensational, for lack of a better word. They are what in the editorial judgment of the news folks. And I respect the news. I'm just saying, you do what you do, we do what we do. But sometimes the facts can be boring. But the facts are the facts. But the fact, so in our minds as cabinet people, we see, you know something? Well, I have given an expansive statement on this matter, and I'm done with that. I remember you have to repeat, you have to repeat, you have to repeat. The same audience may not read the paper every day, so even if you get coverage on a given day, they may not see it, so you have to repeat. And I'd like to say that if you go to church, for example, the messages are messages of many years ago. You go to church, you go to mosque, the messages aren't new. But the religious leaders are always enough to know you have to repeat them the Friday, Saturday, Sunday, whatever is the day of worship. And I think really that in relation to even the matter of accountability, there are people who say that they have not heard of policy X or Y or decision P or Q. And I myself have heard it on a given radio station or newspaper. But here's it. There are 12 or so radio stations in Barbados. There's one print paper and 3 or 4 or whatever online papers. And then there are the days when you don't check the radio or the newspaper. We cannot, as people responsible for government and governance, assume that because we've said it once, that it'll be heard. We have to repeat, and we have to also go to the multiple channels. There are lots of online broadcasts. The people who broadcast at 6 o'clock every evening, or they have the weekly conversations. We have to go to them. We have to go to where the people are to make sure that they are aware. Otherwise, we'll be thinking in our smug way that we have communicated and that we have accounted to the people, and they will have a view that is entirely different. So I trust that has helped answer your question, Commissioner Thompson.
Yes, we are drawing swiftly to the end of this session. Asking the panel just to respond to the questions that were sent and to give your closing remarks.
Sorry. I'll take the first one. I'm not sure if it's a question, but it says, this continued attempt from the panel speakers to legitimize political parties into our constitution really disturbs me. Parties must not be allowed to hijack our government. I really hope to address this hopefully next week. I was trying to work out how best to respond to that or what the author intended. But what I will say is that you know, wearing my political hat, that notwithstanding how I might feel about the party that isn't my party of first choice, the reality is that Barbados has been well served, I believe, by the political parties that has governed it since independence. And therefore, I believe rather than be concerned about legitimizing political parties, the real question should be what can we do to support political parties to ensure their continued independence? Things like campaign financing. What support can we give or should the government give to political parties to level the playing field so that so it contributes to our democracy in terms of ensuring that he who has the biggest paycheck doesn't necessarily win elections because he can, you know, organize the best facts and offer the most inducements, etc. That's what I believe that we should do.
Okay, in terms of closing, perhaps there's a comment here. It interests me how the idea of cabinet functions sounds so clear and pure, yet why then have we ended up with this so problematic civil service, as all led by these honorable directed ministers? Can I hear more of what and why things from their perspective have gone wrong? I want to say to the person who submitted this comment or who penned the comment that while we have issues of underperformance, etc., I don't know that we can say that things have gone wrong, meaning that nothing works. There are issues, but one of the important aspects of our existence as a country has been a public service which has delivered consistently. And one example of that has to do with the way things happen as governments change. We see a government exit office, and maybe at most there's a day off. I'm not even sure that happens anymore. And there's continuity. What happens is, of course, that there are systems which need to be modernized, to be monitored. There's need for proper evaluation, etc. But I wouldn't want anybody to go away with the notion that nothing works. There are a lot of issues, and it has to do with it's a complex situation or set of explanations. But at the end of the day, I think that we have several aspects of our public sector, functioning that are positive, and we are in a position to continuously address those things. So it is not an extreme. I think if we think in terms of a continuum from worst to best case or whatever, that different aspects of government and government's operation fall along those continuum. And it is important that we call for and participate in the improvement of those systems. And ultimately, we have to take individual responsibility for our part in making these things work, whether we are ministers of cabinet, whether we are members of the public service at whatever level. But I would just end by saying that there has been a tradition of good government in Barbados, and I think the fact that we can identify and speak to many of the weaknesses perhaps holds in that situation some of the solutions to the improvement of what we have to do as a people. But we all have to take, as I said, individual responsibility for ensuring that we demand service, whether it's the service of our MPs, our cabinet members, our public officers. And we also have to take responsibility in not only demanding, but delivering that. And I think that's the key to ensuring that our systems work to a large extent.
I'll yield on closing remarks and answer a question here that was sent by one of the, referred by the Commission from WhatsApper. Says the Cabinet Minister has no security of tenure. He can be fired or sacked without any recourse. do you not think that a minister should have a better security? Should he get a 2-month subsistence until he gets back a job? I would say that the interesting thing is that it's amazing how, in order to avoid the appearance of looking after oneself, politicians tend to treat themselves a little less well or more badly than they treat others. Ministers of government, even though you cannot work for anybody else, you're treated for purposes of national insurance as self-employed. So you pay national insurance at the self-employed rate, which also means that you cannot claim unemployment. So the simple matter to that would not be a matter of government paying anything, government giving any gratuity, anything of the sort. It would be a simple matter of the Parliament changing the change being made to recognize that cabinet ministers are really employees of the Crown, they can't do other work, and as opposed to self-employed persons. And the other quick question there was whether a permanent secretary should be allowed to attend cabinet meetings when there is a major paper being considered, and whether the permanent secretary's title should be changed to that of deputy minister and placed on contract. So those are 3 questions, and in 5 seconds each, I would say that the cabinet, as narrowly defined, should be kept for members of the cabinet. The one public officer that's there is the cabinet secretary, but they're cabinet committees, where all your technical officers, your experts, your whomever you may want to bring can join the cabinet committees, sit with the relevant cabinet ministers and trash out the technical matters. But for the final treatment of the paper, it will go forward with the blessing of that committee, and that should not require then that the individual members of the subcommittee be there. And the other matter of nomenclature, I think that the nomenclature is used in Canada. In Canada, they refer to their permanent secretaries as deputy ministers. And in truth and in fact, I used to approach my ministry with that in mind, because when you have titles which are so far different, sometimes you could think that one is from Venus and the other is from Mars. And I used to always see my PS as my deputy minister. We're in this together, we're partners. And I was always say, you are the one to tell me if I'm talking nonsense, if I'm going crazy. You know, let us have that kind of relationship. As far as, so whether the title is changed or not, it is more how the function is performed. But I think that if in the course of public sector reform, the experts in that area deem that some title changes may help with that aspect of the reform and the work, that's fine by me, but I wouldn't advocate for it one way or the other. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to participate in this panel.
Thank you, panel. I now invite Dr. Richard Ishmael, member of the Parliamentary Reform Commission, to lead the vote of thanks.
Good night. Excuse me. I want to start by begging your indulgence to my hoarseness. Had an injury to my throat many years ago, and I get periodically hoarse. So just beg my indulgence. I think you should be able to understand. On behalf of the commissioners of the Parliamentary Reform Committee, I would like to first thank the governing body and principal and deputy principal of the Lester Vaughn School for allowing us to use their lovely facilities this evening. This is our first town hall meeting, and we seek to engage Barbadians here and in the diaspora to help us carry out the mandate given to us to reform our parliamentary system as we move forward from a post-colonial state into our Republican state. Our previous town halls were done at the Barbados Workers' Union, Foundation School, Princess Mary School, and last Thursday night at the Alexandra School. Our panel and guest speakers have dealt with the workings of the entire parliamentary system, the workings in the House Assembly, workings in the Senate, and tonight our esteemed panel, Senator Reginald Farley, President of the Senate and Cabinet Member, Mr. Adriel Brathwaite SC, former Attorney General and Cabinet member, and and Ms. Maxine McLean, former Senator, member of Senate, and a member of our commission. They have given excellent insights into the workings of Cabinet and opened our eyes to what goes on in Cabinet. I would like to thank them very much for the erudite presentation. I also thank Peter Wickham, journalist and social commentator, for his third presentation to us from overseas. I would like to acknowledge Oversight, who has been in charge of our live streaming for those at home and in the diaspora, and also Ms. Paula Medford for her interpretation for the hearing impaired. I would like to thank our parliamentary team headed by Mr. Pedro Eastman, the Clerk of Parliament and Secretary of the Commission, and his team for their organizational skills putting together this town hall. This is a hard-working team and supplies the Commission with all of its needs. I would also like to thank those who came in tonight and questions and presentations. Also to those who have joined us online. And I understand from Senator Thompson that we have 300 online tonight and about 200 watched us last week. I'd like to thank the Barbados Police Force for the coverage of the event. And finally, I would like to thank my fellow commissioners. This is really a hard-working team with a mixture of youth and experience, which blends well together, and is ably led by Sir Richard Cheltenham and Sir Roy Trotman. I am a medic in the midst of lawyers, trade unionists, management specialists, university lecturers, and past parliamentarians. I feel very comfortable in their presence and happy to make a contribution to my country in a different sphere than medicine. I thank Sir Richard Cheltenham for his opening remarks and Commissioner Corey Beckles for chairing the session. It is just left for me tonight to bid you a good night, get home safely, and to join us at the 6th Town Hall meeting at the Steel Shed, Queen's Park, next Thursday, 21st of September, where we'll engage the youth of Barbados. Good night, all. Have a good night.
Thank you, Dr. Ishmael. Have a wonderful night.
So you know that you're going to have to do the video.
Yeah.